So I have with me today the two authors of Shallow Waters, which appeared in the Texas Observer and Quartz, Naveena Sadasivam and Zoe Schlanger. And did I mutilate both of your names?
It's Naveena Sadasivam, but close. You got mine pretty good.
Okay, good. So, thank you for joining me in the first official Texas+Water podcast. And I can tell you that, I read the 9-part series and really, really enjoyed it. And as you'll find out, there are a lot of areas and issues that we have kind of tracked each other on. I realized that's how I was reading it. And for example, one of the things that stood out to me is I was one of the reviewers for the new book, A Thirsty Land. Mm-hmm. And of course, Seamus McGraw is the author of that book. And, he was in that book in part writing about issues along the border and out in West Texas. And so, I had a little refresher on some of the issues affecting that part of the state prior to reading this series. So let's just start off a little bit with some background here. And I'd just like to hear from both of you, why you decided to write about water and climate change along the Texas-Mexico border, and what was the real catalyst for that?
Sure. Well, I could start with that. This is Zoe Schlanger at Quartz. So we at Quartz, me and my editor Elijah Wolfson, were looking into a grant that was going to fund a journalism piece that would be a collaboration between a global newsroom and a more regional newsroom. And we're trying to think about ideas, and I cover the environment, so we're looking in that general area of climate change. And we started looking at different places in the U.S. that might have an undercovered climate story. So we were looking at increased rainfall, let's say, in the Northeast over time, and then aridity in other parts of the country. And we really zoomed in on the border between Texas and Mexico, in part because it's one of the fastest forming regions in the U.S. And secondly, because it's a place where people seem to believe in climate change disproportionately compared to their neighbors in the state. So the counties along the border between Texas and Mexico in Texas seem to have a much clearer idea about climate change that's happening, that they believe climate change is much more than people more interior in the state of Texas. So we thought that was interesting. And then clearly the border dynamics there have global importance, certainly national importance, and there's a lot of good regional work being done on that. And so it just came naturally down to thinking about water, and that's when we reached out to Naveena and her editor and started coming up with some ideas.
Yeah, and Zoe and Elijah, the editor at Quartz, approached us at that point, and wanted to talk about climate change along the border and how that affects water resources. And so we had numerous calls just talking about that broad topic and how we wanted to focus and what we would bring that was new to the table. And so that's kind of where we started. I was fairly interested in the border and writing about water issues along the border because I had written quite a bit about water already. I had covered, I'd researched the Colorado River when I was at ProPublica previously, and so I had a fairly strong interest in water issues, and so this project idea just fit perfectly in with my interests.
Yeah.
So, what surprised you most during your research? And I'm curious about also whether did y'all actually travel to the border at one point, or did you essentially do this from I guess Austin and New York?
Zoe, do you want to go first? Sure. Well, I can start with your first question about what surprised at least me the most. I think that the biggest topic, the biggest overarching meta theme that surprised me is how completely unregulated most water at borders is. And we're hearing a lot about, a world without water or with less water given climate change in the future. And there's so many places globally where there's water at borders and no international treaty to handle it. And far fewer treaties to deal with groundwater. And there's some attention on border surface water. So first of all, that it just seems like a ticking time bomb now that we know much more about it and the situation and how dire it is in some places. So that being a huge geopolitical issue that I never saw come up in the news cycle very much seems really surprising to me. I'd also say, one of the stories I was working on was about El Paso and the water infrastructure there, and it was pretty remarkable to see El Paso be one of the leaders in terms of cutting-edge water technology in the country, which makes a lot more sense when you realize they just sort of have to be. Has been a dire need to figure out out-of-the-box solutions to dealing with water scarcity and border water. They share an aquifer with Ciudad Juarez, but that was kind of a fun realization to realize that El Paso is the center of a lot of water technology right now.
Yeah, one of the things that really surprised me, when I was in the Valley and I was reporting about farmers and urban folks fighting over water from the Rio Grande, I began to notice sort of a pattern with the farmers that I was talking to. I knew that the Valley was predominantly Hispanic, but the large number of farmers and irrigation district managers that I talked to were predominantly white, and I began to wonder why that was. And when I looked into the statistics, I found out that the population is heavily Hispanic. It's over 90% Hispanic in the Valley, but 75% of the farmland in the region is owned by white farmers. And so that came as a huge surprise, and my curiosity about how that came to be and why that was led to one of the sidebars. It's one of the 9 pieces in the project, is examining the history of the Valley and how the racial dynamics played out over the years.
So let me ask you this. What's been the general reaction? What kind of feedback have you got? I mean, obviously, I made it clear that I really, really like the series. But what have you heard from other people?
Naveena, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, I would say. I'll speak for myself. My intention with this project was to sort of explain a really complex water system in the region along the Texas-Mexico border to a lay audience. So I wanted the stories to be interesting enough to a person who had never really considered water issues as being political, had never thought about how maybe they turn on the tap and get water. And so it was really meant for a lay audience, and I think it reached a fairly wide audience, partly because of the visuals that we had, the way the stories were written. It was often narrative driven. You had characters, interesting people that you could latch onto, even if the issues themselves were very technical and complex. You had interesting folks that we spoke to that are in the stories. And so in that sense, I think it's been widely read. I don't know what the metrics are on our website, and I don't recall. I think we checked them about a month in, and I'm not recalling now what those numbers were, but I remember we had fairly good readership on those stories. On Twitter, on social media, the stories got shared widely. Both Zoe and I were invited on numerous radio shows. Zoe went on PBS NewsHour to talk about it. So I think the stories got disseminated fairly widely, and so that was the intention. The idea was to get these issues in front of a lay audience, and I think on that front we succeeded.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Naveena said, and I'll just say, perhaps as many water experts might be aware, water infrastructure, things like groundwater, the kind of arcane way water rights get split up. These are some of the least sexy topics for a wider audience, people who are not complete water nerds. And so, I think I would definitely count it a real win that there was, radio producers interested in booking joining us, that there was a pretty good readership, saw a lot of chatter on Twitter. People were engaging, which was great to see.
Yeah. Have you gotten any feedback from decision makers, people who run water districts or water agencies, or folks from the legislature or from Congress? Have you got any feedback from any of those venues?
Yeah, I think we got a few emails, a few tweets. Senator Jose Rodriguez, for instance, from the El Paso area, has been consistently tweeting out our stories, and I got an email from one of his staffers thanking me for working on the project and for writing these stories. And we also, I think, saw the Mexican consulate in Austin tweeting and sharing the stories. And we got a few emails from folks, from irrigation district managers, for instance, thanking us for writing stories, taking an in-depth look at these issues, and helping people understand how complex really these things, the management of the Rio Grande is. So, yeah, that's what I heard. Zoe, what did you hear?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned that I guess one other person in a sort of a decision-making position is the person who deals with border affairs at TCE.
Right.
Also tweeted it. But yeah, I think you covered it.
So I'm thinking here that you kind of took a look at a situation that's very complicated in terms of just the water issues. I mean, the water issues on the Rio Grande are different than anywhere else in the state of Texas, and the way Texas handles water is different than pretty much any other state handles water. And what impressed me was that Zoe being in New York and Naveena being in Austin, and maybe not being in Texas that long, I mean, you really figured out how the system works quickly, and were able to get into the details of the issues that in a way that was complex and had great depth to it. And that's one of the things that stood out to me, because I was thinking about how hard it would be, for example, for me to write about water issue in another country, or even another state. Some states are more complex than others in how they manage their water. And so talk to me a little bit about what process, or whether you went through a process, maybe you didn't, of understanding the system.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you it coming off that way, and I'm glad you feel that way about the pieces. Thank you, Todd. But I would say this is definitely our job. It's both like the joy and the terror of being journalists, is jumping into areas where you don't have so much prior expertise. Both Naveena and I have been covering the environment for a while, so we do have a general familiarity with some of these issues. But in terms of me reporting, being based in New York and covering water issues in a state with very specific, like you said, water management practices that are unique in the country and the world, I think it's the driving fear of most journalists that they might get something wrong. So at least what I did, and I think Naveena does this as well, is what some people call over-reporting, where you just keep calling people and make sure you've talked to the people who know what they're talking about, read the right papers. We've talked to it combined. We have a huge Google Doc that we use to organize this project, because collaborating means tons and tons of documents between people, where we kept all of our transcripts from our interviews. And I don't know how many are in there, but it certainly felt to me like we spoke to well over 50 people, if not more, whose job it is or lifetime work it has been to understand Texas water issues and Mexican water issues and border dynamics. So yeah, it's just a matter of reporting. It's a total blessing to have a job like this, but it's fun and also scary, and we just do our best.
Yeah, I agree with what Zoe said about just the fear of getting it wrong. I think my worst nightmare is working on a project for 6 months, 8 months, and then for it to come out and be ridiculed or to get angry emails from, the folks who care about these issues a lot telling me that I got it completely wrong. So it's very validating to hear from you that you thought we did okay.
You did.
So there is a lot of fear for sure. There's a ton of over-reporting, and you asked earlier about whether we traveled to the places that we reported on. We absolutely did. We were in El Paso for a water conference, a binational water conference, and so we got to meet a lot of the decision makers face to face. The IBWC commissioners were there. Ed Archuleta, who I believe he was El Paso Water's manager for a long time and heralded that group into conserving water. He was also there, and so we met a lot of these folks face to face. We had long conversations with them over the phone. I went down to the valley for about a week, and I stayed there, and I met with irrigation district managers, and they drove me around the district, and I hung out with them for entire days, just watching them work and asking them questions over and over and over again in 100 different ways, making sure that I understood exactly how they worked and what their responsibilities were, and what they thought of these issues. So it was definitely over-reporting, meeting face-to-face with people, and the driving fear of getting it wrong.
And a lot of fact-checking.
Yes. And I will add that we, at the Observer, my editor is a Texan. He was born and raised in Texas, and he covered the environment before he became an editor. So he brought a lot of expertise and a keen eye to this project, I think. And so that helps quite a bit when you have someone looking over your shoulder and making sure that you're not making some egregious mistake.
So I came within a whisker of joining you at that conference in El Paso. I was in Reno doing a 3-day workshop for judges that have water litigation, and so it's the National Judicial College is located in Reno, and so I was asked to come up there with some other presenters and talk about water litigation and resolution of cases through mediation and things like that. And I was leaving, and I was looking at the one in El Paso, and I was thinking, I wonder if I can actually get back in Texas and take a flight and get down there, before most of it's not over. And the answer was no, unfortunately. So let me ask you about this. And so in the interest of full disclosure, I actually am part of a company that Aaron Wolf is also part of. We are both part of a group called Four Worlds Partners, which is essentially a group of mediators who do water mediation. And except for myself, Aaron and the other partners are all located in Corvallis at Oregon State University. So I was, interested when I was reading, the information you had from Aaron and his studies on how, really cooperation is much more common than conflict in terms of water issues around the world. When you first heard that, what was your reaction? Because it's my sense is that people really don't know that.
I think that our first story, our opening story, is looking at this macro issue of water at borders globally. Aaron's research seemed really pertinent to that because, like you said, he's found that something like 2 out of every 3 actions, no matter what they are, border water, are collaborative rather than conflict-based or aggressive. And that's a fascinating context. I mean, what he's saying is that the world sort of looks away too soon when there's some kind of conflict that's sparked regarding water at borders, and that if people continue paying attention, if media say, or the public interest stayed on whether or not people are, or how cooperation that we have at the moment. So that means totally to run counter to the narrative that I believed before setting out this project, that as the world warms, as water resources deplete, that will be launched to total chaos in a way. But it sounds a lot more like there's major opportunity for collaboration if people acknowledge the issue fast enough. And we heard this from other experts as well, that kind of the best antidote for potential future conflict is good science. And in places where there's good science starting up, there's probably a lot less chance of major conflict in the future. And that's definitely something we're seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border, especially with things like the survey of groundwater aquifers that is happening between the U.S. and Mexico with aquifers on the border. These are all things that will prevent a future run on water, which is what people expect to happen, I think.
Yeah, I will say, as a journalist, I think the longer you are a journalist, the more cynical you become. And so when we first embarked on this project, I was very much expecting those stories to be about conflict, about people disagreeing and people fighting over water, because that was, like Zoe's saying, the overarching narrative that I had heard over and over and over again. There's that saying that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And so it seemed like fights over water are inevitable. That like Zoe was saying, as the world warms, that we're going to be thrown into chaos and there'll be more fights over water. But I think Zoe was the one who found the research and talked to Aaron and kind of backed up the fact that there is more cooperation. And when we were talking about that, it was very surprising, and it completely changed my perspective on water issues and how I thought about them. I think one of the things that we saw over and over again is that humans tend to adapt, that when there are problems, humans respond to them. And whether that's trying to find new sources of water through desalination or toilet to tap, there are challenges, of course, with managing water, but there are also solutions to them. And, there are very smart people thinking about how to find those fixes. So give me a little bit of hope, actually, in reporting this project.
Definitely.
I think what is not maybe readily apparent when people think about that issue is that, a lot of these water issues are very difficult and expensive and require you to sit down with people that you don't normally sit down with. And, there's the initial kind of burst of discordance or fighting or arguing, usually has to precede, anything that's productive that comes later. I mean, we have a water planning process in the state of Texas, which we've had water planning in the state for about almost 70 years. But many of the issues that the regional water planning groups deal with are not nearly as contentious as, say, the Edwards Aquifer issue, or the issue with the Rio Grande, or someplace else. And so it's these big issues that people just kind of avoid because they think, oh, that's never going to be resolved, or that's just a disaster waiting to happen. It seems like it's got to get some kind of push. So.
Yeah. I think, just to add to that, one other surprising thing we found while reporting this is just how much water-making decisions come down to individual personalities, and how much relationships, one-on-one or, team-on-team relationships between people in charge of doing this type of water diplomacy seem to make such a radical difference. Hearing a lot about how the IBWC's relationship is different, say, than the relationship between water managers in the Middle East, in places where water bodies are shared, the way that the IBWC seems to meet extremely frequently. And as one of the commissioners told us, how important it is to ask about the other side's grandkids, and you drink whiskey together and talk about things that aren't water related, to be able to keep that possibility for cooperation going when there's times that could result in conflict.
Yeah, exactly. You gotta build trust before you can actually do the work. And I think, with the challenges that come with climate change in a warming world, I think that's pushing people to work together too. The fact that the Rio Grande is drying up, the snow melt has decreased by 20% in the last 50 years, evaporation rates are increasing. All of that means that there's less water to go between everybody who needs it. So, I think it's imperative that people work together to figure out solutions.
So I'm here in my office and I'm looking at the portrait photo we took of the stakeholders for the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan the day that we all agreed on a plan, which took 5 years of meeting and negotiating. And most of those, or many of those people in that photo, couldn't stand to be in the same room with the other person when we started. And we'd been suing each other over and over, and we'd been fighting in the legislature every session. And, because we met every month for 5 years and then had subcommittee and work group committee meetings in between, people got to know each other, and we'd have lunch together during those meetings, and we even had a couple of retreats where, some of the members played music, and, we all went to a bar, and all those things that you just talked about, I've seen that actually happen, and it really is critical when you can, when the person on the other side of the board or on the other side of the room is kind of a figure without a whole lot of detail in your mind, and you don't know them, you don't know anything about them. It's much easier to vilify them than it is after you really sat down and got to know somebody, as you indicated.
Right. If you're sharing meals with someone, if you're, singing karaoke with them or playing music with them, I think you start seeing them as a full human being. And so I guess that makes room for trust and a relationship before you start working on those difficult challenges.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So I have to mention this before I forget. I've been trying to encourage the creation of a water library here in Texas to preserve documents related to planning of water projects and major water litigation and things of that nature. But I hope that all that documentation you mentioned earlier and interviews and all that, I hope you all preserve that. And someday, you never know, maybe we'll get that water library going, and there might be a home for it.
Well, I'm pro archive of every kind, so that sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. We have all of our files and interviews and everything else in one shared Google Drive, so it should be fairly easy to archive that.
Totally.
So, that's very high tech for me. I'm just barely able to do this podcast, and we've got all that put together like that. So let me fast forward to today and ask you about something. So, Texas and New Mexico, of course, are suing each other before the Supreme Court, and it looks like now that there's a new special master has been appointed in that case, that the hearings will actually start in 2020. And in the now you got some interference there. And in the meantime, I don't know if you saw this, but the other day, Elephant Butte reached the 3% full level, which is lower than what you had mentioned in your articles. And on top of that, I guess we still don't have an IBWC commissioner.
Correct.
So, would you look at that? I mean, well, I'm not going to put any words in your mouth. What do you think?
Naveena, you wanna try?
Yeah, sure. I think the IBWC saw this coming. They've been working together with Mexican officials to model the Rio Grande, and Zoe can speak to this some more because she did the actual interviews with the IBWC folks. But the IBWC has been planning for these disaster scenarios for a while now. They employ a lot of smart technical engineers who've seen this coming. We are in a bit of a difficult situation because, like you said, the former IBWC Commissioner Ed Drusina was asked to step down, and that slot hasn't been filled, so that is a bit of a hiccup, but the hope is, I think, that the Trump administration will fill his position soon and talks can resume. And it is important to note that, even if you don't have a commissioner, you do have the entire working staff. So the IBWC does depend on numerous technical staff, and so I'm sure that the negotiations are proceeding, and just because a commissioner isn't in place doesn't mean that there's no work that's happening to addressing those situations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's definitely important to emphasize that the IWC staff, a lot of them have been there a long time. And though Mr. Drusina had a really long-standing and friendly relationship with his counterpart in Mexico, Mr. Salmon, the person who's now the acting commissioner has been with the commission, I think, something like 30 years. And the nice thing about the commissioner, the requirements, even for an acting commissioner, is that you be a accredited, water engineer. You have to have an engineering degree. I guess the hope is that the staff has enough capacity behind it to see it through some of these things, but it's not ideal not to have a figurehead, a secure figurehead in place. And thanks for some of these conversations. Right.
That's a good point. So let me turn to mega droughts. And
sure.
So now, Zoe, did you do that article?
Yeah, I did.
And you worked with the tree ring lab at the University of Arkansas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And who did you work with there?
You know what? We talked to so many people. Oh, David Stahl, who is director of program. He's been a dendrochronologist for a very long time, and has a bevy of grad students who are all out absolutely by hand documenting tree rings in various forests all over the country.
So this is why, I said earlier when we started that, we've been in a lot of the same territory together. So that tree ring lab, I organized a tree ring study here in Texas about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And it wasn't Dr. Stolle, but it was his son, who was one of the grad students who did the data collection for us. The principal investigator was Malcolm Cleveland, who is now...
Small world.
Right.
Really.
And so Malcolm is now professor emeritus at Arkansas, but he and David had done tree ring studies. They had done tree ring studies. Yeah, I have to figure out how to edit these things, these podcasts. But they had done research down in Mexico on Montezuma cypress, and so Dr. Cleveland and I are both geographers, and I had met him when I was getting my doctorate. And so I contacted him and I said, well, why don't we do a study in Texas? Because, all these tree ring studies, including the ones that you were talking about in your article, use, for the most part, they use chronologies in Mexico and New Mexico and California and places that are very far away. And so we went around. Yes, it took a few years, but we went around and took almost 800 samples from about 350 bald cypress trees in central Texas, and reconstructed the drought cycle back to 1500, which prior to that, I think it had been reconstructed back to 1700. I think Dr. Cleveland had actually done that work. And, one of the things that we found was that, what's happening out west is often different than what's happening here. And that's because, when you look at New Mexico or Arizona or even the interior of Mexico, when you get to here, you've got, of course, the Gulf. And so some of the mega droughts in the past, look like they were not happening here. But we also found some droughts in which I think maybe a mega drought pretty close, about 20 years of drought from 1697 to 1717, which were, 20 years, substantially longer, twice as long as the drought of record in Texas, which started in the late 40s and ended in 57, and more severe than that drought. And
that's really interesting.
Yeah, and so I'm always interested when I see other tree ring studies, but the point is the studies that you use for your article were actually the appropriate ones, because the headwaters are in Colorado and New Mexico, and the area that we studied, say if you fast forward one of those mega droughts to today, it's the water consumption here might be different than the conditions in the upper watershed, because you might have more locally, available rainfall during that period. But what they were saying in that study is really fascinating to me, and it's something that what I worry about is that people really are not prepared here, even though we did go through a very significant 5-year drought recently, which ended with a flood in Wimberley, which destroyed my oldest tree in the study.
Oh, no.
Yeah, right there.
How old is that tree?
Well, we couldn't get to the center of it. We didn't have a tree ring bore that was long enough, but we got back to 1426, and we think the tree was probably a sapling around 1380.
Wow.
And, it's only one data point, but let me just say this, that the flood in Wimberley, that tree survived every flood that came down that watershed from, about 1380 until 2015.
Yeah, wow. I mean, and that kind of goes to show you the effects of climate change, right? You have droughts that are severe and are getting more severe and more intense, and you also have rainfall events that are getting more intense, like that Wimberley flood. So I think that's a good demonstration of just how climate change is pushing us forward into an era of more extreme weather events.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's remarkable. 1380, huh?
Yeah.
What I like about tree ring studies is that, even skeptics on climate change, they understand drought. And, when they see those results, they don't really have any difficulty accepting them. And so, that's one of the things that I try to focus on is, we know that this happened at some time in the past here. It's always possible we can get another drought like this, or one even worse. Even though you don't know when it would happen, but.
And clearly with Elk Butte at the level it's at, we know we can't do this for even 2 years. We can't have another winter so dry as the one we had this past winter.
Yeah. So Tom,
30 years.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt y'all.
No, please.
I'm actually at a federal courthouse trying to report on a trial, and I think the jury is going to come back in with a verdict any moment now. So I do have to jump off this call in a few minutes.
Okay. Well, let's just wrap up quickly, and you just interrupt me when you got to go.
Okay.
So I guess, I've just got two final questions. One is, so has this project encouraged you to look around for some other similar water issues that you could do another, in-depth, multi-series investigation on?
I definitely think our editors want a break from such things. But given that, we both have this well of knowledge now, and it's definitely made me look at the idea of border water as a viable beat for the future, something that I could jump into without too much upstart research for just getting the basic knowledge. So I'm definitely interested in doing another collaboration or some kind of thing on border water, maybe in a different region. But yeah, certainly. Nothing in the works yet, though.
Yeah, nothing in the works yet, but yeah, my feelings and thoughts are similar to Zoe's. I've always been very interested in water, and I find the legal practices and the management practices around it fascinating. So, if the right story presents itself and we have the time and the editors have the interest, then
and the grant money
in the works. And the grant money, yes. Not to forget that.
Okay.
Totally.
Well, the last question is, before we sign off, do you have any questions for me? I thought that would catch you off guard.
Not really. I've followed the Texas Water Journal for a while, and I've been interested to see all the research that's been published there. So that's a great resource. And I believe you were one of the founding members of that journal. Is that correct, Todd?
That's right. It started the way a lot of good things do, out of frustration and anger. So publishing in other journals and having to do ridiculous stuff to get the articles out, etc.
I see.
And so we decided, we could do better. So
Sure.
Yeah, it's a great resource for people like me who are looking to learn more about water.
Definitely. I mean, as far as questions from me, I'm probably going to follow up with you about that tree that was a sapling in 1390. Sounds fascinating. But for another conversation.
Great. Well, listen, thank you both for being our first official podcast for Texas+Water. And I'm, still trying to figure out all the technical aspects of putting the podcast on the web and doing all that. But hopefully here in the next week or two, we'll have that available for the public. And at any rate, you've really been great to take time out to do this. And I look forward to seeing what you each do individually, or if you ever have a chance to work together, what you do collectively.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for having us on the podcast. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues further.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah, thank you, Todd.
Oh, you're most welcome, both of you. And so, thanks, and hope it's an interesting trial that you're covering, Naveena.
It's an employment discrimination case against TCEQ.
Oh, well, there's no water in that, so
No.
Okay.
Although the person who was discriminated against, who claims he was discriminated against, was a hydrologist at TCEQ. So there's been some peripheral water stuff that's been brought up about the drought and so on. But yeah.
We'll probably have to edit that out. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. Take care, Todd.
You too.
Good luck, Naveena.
Okay. Bye, Zoe.
Thanks, Zoe.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.